goodness.
Apologies. All right, can you guys hear us okay now?
Okay,
Perfect.
great.
Tiffany, do you mind beginning from,
Yeah.
starting from the beginning?
Okay, so well, you gave me a very nice introduction, but I'll go over where I'm coming from because actually I just moved. G was introducing me as assistant professor at Cornell. I actually just started my appointment January 1st, and prior to that, I was at the University of Stuttgart at the Institute for Computational Design and Construction for the past 8 years. And I was the research group leader of material programming research group and also teaching in the iTech Masters of Science program. I think here at Autodesk in Boston, you're probably familiar with a lot of our students. You've generously hosted our students every year in the summer. So yeah, so you've probably seen a little bit about our work. And now I'm at the Department of Design Tech in Cornell, where I also lead a research group called Multi-Meso Lab, and I'm also teaching in the new Master of Science in Design Technology program. I also want to emphasize that a lot of my work is very interdisciplinary. I'll talk about that in through my work, but the research that I do is really about integrating different disciplines, how to work with bio-based materials, turn materials that are usually considered as with disadvantageous properties into advantages. For example, woodworking. Also, how to mimic the structural layering of a lot of natural structures, and using emerging technologies, and how to design our projects and buildings in response to the environment for better functionality. So yeah, and that's all with the goal of presenting an alternative to conventional methods of design and making. So before I go into these projects, I want to explain a little bit about where I'm coming from. I actually have been making things for practically my entire life. I actually built my first 3D printer 15 years ago. And also, I've done a lot of projects from various scales, from origami robots to large-scale art installations. And actually, this is a project. On the right is a project that G and I worked on together. And yeah, so having made so much stuff throughout my life, and also as an architect building buildings, I was increasingly confronted with the environmental responsibility that comes with the act of making. And so this is something I found very interesting, considering that humans only make up 1/10 of the world's biomass, which is all the natural materials that is created on Earth. Since the year 1900, the anthropogenic mass, which is the accumulation of all the objects made by humans, has doubled every 20 years. And according to a recent study, that anthropogenic mass has actually surpassed the biomass. And in fact, the biomass has actually decreased because of forestation and our overall industrial activities. So this was something that made me realize that the climate problem is really a problem of making and how we use materials. And as architects, many of us are architects here, we are also largely responsible for this through the materials that we use, the construction materials, for infrastructure, for buildings, building operations like heating and cooling for maintaining occupant comfort. That's 28% of all CO2 emissions. And just overall, the industrial activities, manufacturing, it's over 2/3 of the global share of CO2 emissions. So I thought, how do we address this problem? I really think we need to reuse the materials that we make through adaptation. And a lot of my inspiration comes from nature, because actually nature is really productive. It's manufacturing things all the time. It's silently making materials that are really performative. For example, like trees, which are able to grow over 100 meters using minimal material, and also these organisms and structures are also really have a lot of robust functionality. For example, being able to move in response to environmental stimuli. For example, sunflowers tracking the sun paths. So, and this is really different from the way that we typically build things. You know, we think about automation and with like very bulky hardware, mechanical, electrical devices. So yeah, how do we adapt like biology? And there are a lot of different examples in nature through growth and other mechanisms. And what I'm really interested in are these methods of seed dispersal. And so actually, when these seeds fall from the tree or from the plant, they're actually dead, right? Like they're just materials, but that are disconnected from the supply of the plant, but their functionality is very important for their propagation, and it's evolved to be incredibly robust and have a very efficient form factor. So, you know, one of the kind of classic examples that you're probably aware of is a pine cone, but I think it's such a good example of a biological material which is structured in such a way that it can reliably open its scales without consuming any metabolic energy. And I work with biologists, and they have discovered, or they have been studying this pine cone that has been fossilized. It's roughly 14 million years old, but it still can open and close, which I think is very remarkable. So yeah, taking a closer look at the structure on the right, you can see that it's made up of these swellable cellulose fibers that are arranged in two directional layers. And this is the bilayer structure that causes the scale to open in response to moisture changes. And it's a very simple mechanism. So my goal was to see, you know, how we could apply that type of mechanism to building skins that maybe can provide shading, can ventilate, depending on the weather, without any operating energy. And maybe we can eventually replace air conditioning and heating. So I'm going to talk about my in the next projects. I'm going to really focus on the PhD research that I've been doing. And one of the core challenges is how to design for 4D printing, because this is a very different design paradigm than we're used to, of designing static objects and designing just the outer boundary of that object. And so I want to explain how 4D printing works is that through the process of extrusion, it creates these anisotropic features on the material layer. And when you print it with a hygroscopic material, like a wood-based material, it can swell or shrink in a controlled direction. And when you print a less swellable layer on top of that, then similar to the pine cone structure that we saw earlier, the resulting bilayer can bend in one direction when swelling and the other direction when shrinking. So yeah, to develop the tools, one of my first steps was to systematically explore this principle by programming the extrusion path with different properties and control the shape change to bend in different directions, to control the amount of bending and also the speed of bending. And we can even combine these different, what I call bilayer building blocks together to create different geometric possibilities. So the mesostructures kind of, what I call the mesostructures, like this analog material code that tells the material how to react in response to the environment. And in order to understand and verify how that material's mesostructure responds to environment, I printed a bunch of these permutations of those extrusion parameters and tested them in lab-generated conditions. And those experimental data was used to develop a computational workflow where we could configure an assembly of bilayers and preview the shape change and also generate that intricate mesostructure, such as the one that you can see on the left. So this process allowed us to focus on the high-level design and not worry about programming the machine code of where exactly that extrusion path has to go. You don't have to draw line by line each path, and you can integrate that design from digital, the design process from a digital object to a physical object, and then also create a lot of different types of shape changes. I actually shared this, through my teaching and through my research, I shared this workflow with my students, with my colleagues, and I was really happy to see that in this example, I taught this workshop to bachelor students in Austria who were not really in a computational design program. They're a very traditional bachelor's of architecture who some of them didn't know how to use Grasshopper and some of them didn't know how to use any modeling programs, CAD modeling programs. And I was very proud that everyone was able to create their self-shaping design. Another thing that I wanted to kind of talk about was this project that I did, this exhibition that I did 2 years ago in London for the London Design Biennale. And what's really interesting about curved folding specifically is that through self-shaping and 4D printing, we can actually create these self-actuated mechanisms, and different from curve folding, traditional curve folding, where it's bent on the creases. Since we're actuating the entire surface, we really distribute the stress concentrations, and these are, as a result, much more robust than a traditional curve folding design, which is mechanically bent into place. And there's also some really interesting aspects to this research, which I'm now exploring with physicists who are trying to create the math to describe this mechanism, this property. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the next challenge, which is how to upscale 4D printing, how to use automation platforms, and how to use construction materials. So, well, wood, I think we all know, is a very well-known material that's really easy to scale, build volume with. It also has high actuation forces, and you can use them also in a bilayer and upscale them, but it has a very low resolution of programmability, whereas 3D printing has a really high resolution of detail in customizing mechanical properties. So I developed a large-scale additive manufacturing platform with multiple end effectors, such as this vacuum gripper for the pick and placement of those wood actuators, and also a large format extruder for the 3D printing of metal material structures to produce a large scale 4D printed structure. And in transitioning from that desktop scale to the large scale, we had to make several adjustments, like the tool path had to be continuous and non-crossing. So there's a lot of things that you can do at the small scale that you can't do at the large scale. We also had to recalibrate those 3D printing parameters. And although the general relationships between pattern depth, thickness, cell resolution, aspect ratio, and geometry remained the same. So we could then program areas of stretching. We could program areas with very high stiffness in a certain direction. And we could also program areas that bent in different directions so that a flat fabricated structure can create this doubly curved shape without any operating energy or any mechanical force. So based on this large-scale additive manufacturing platform, I also supervised my master thesis students to explore the unique properties of auxetic metamaterial structures, which interestingly, when bent, forms surfaces from positive to negative Gaussian curvature, depending on the pattern, from the inverted hexagon to the normal hexagon pattern. And in order for like a flat geometry to create a shell structure, it requires each part of that surface to shrink and contract in different directions. So the pattern allowed us to do this, and we fabricated this 3-meter long, functionally graded structure with varying Gaussian curvatures on the surface. And it took 13 hours to print, so considering that size is a relatively fast result. And yeah, and we also published a paper out of it, and this is actually the largest thing that we've printed so far. So hopefully we're gonna continue printing even larger things. And we also used this large-scale additive manufacturing platform for an Acadia workshop that we did during the pandemic. And here we were exploring not just additive manufacturing, but the combination of that with milling in order to create higher precision joints and integration between the wood and 3D printed parts. So yeah, so we also, some of the things that our students created were also really interesting, like this bendy beam, but it's very compliant design, which is really interesting to see at such a large scale. And so I think this is a very interesting area to develop for, you know, buildings that are compliant to earthquakes and other loads. Now, the next project, I will talk about how we can translate working principles from biology to design and engineering application, and vice versa. So this is the project that I did really in really close collaboration with biologists at the University of Freiburg and also the University Hospital. And now zooming down from architecture, or like scaling down from architecture, we looked at orthotics as a motivating example, because here there's a really big need for customization and adaptation for specific patient pathologies. So if you've ever broken your arm, you know that you have to get a cast of your arm and immobilize it, but every month or so you had to probably go back to the doctor to recast it, because of muscular atrophy, which means that your arm gets thinner from not using those muscles. And fit is really important for rehabilitation. So with my biologist partners, we found this really interesting plant called the air potato. And it has this really interesting mechanism of generating squeezing forces in a very efficient way. So it's actually because of these stipules that are located on the basal outgrowths of its leaves. And when they grow and expand, they actually tension the helix. So that's the tensioning mechanism that we were really interested in. So we first abstracted that tensioning mechanism to 4D printing, which is, you know, defined by this coiling structure and these little pockets, as we call them, that kind of create the space between the helix and the host structure. So this is the overview of that biomimetic process. You can see the biological role model, the two mechanisms that we are abstracting, the helix and the pocket mechanisms. And we can customize both of these into one printed and fabricated device. And we can also evaluate it for the applications in which those squeezing forces are important. So first, we compared the helix mechanism and the pocket mechanism on a pole. So this is a 30 millimeter diameter pole, and we tracked it as it was absorbing moisture. It fell after 40 minutes, and with the pocket mechanism, it was able to adapt to a 15 millimeter diameter pole over 3 hours. So we also measured the reverse, the squeezing forces, and we compared the different, the helix mechanism with the pocket mechanisms, with more pocket mechanisms. And we can see that when you have more of these pocket mechanisms, the squeezing forces can be tuned to increase. But what was the most, effective strategy is if you actually programmed delay of those pocket mechanisms, and you could achieve the highest amount of forces. So through programming time, we can tune the squeezing and the pressure even more. We also designed or I guess prototyped a process in which we imagined medical specialists could utilize this approach by mocking up a design on the patient and then scanning and reconstructing the printing geometry in order to achieve a desired shape and design. So here is a design of a splint with the bioinspired mechanism, which wraps around the wrist and forearm at different curvatures. What's the most the biggest takeaway that I want to share here is that through understanding biology and, the air potato, these stipules that create that force generation, they only occur very sporadically in nature. So through computational design and 4D printing, we can actually tune our products and our objects to have more of those desirable properties and achieve even higher forces than what we see in nature. And that's indeed what we also saw. I just want to just briefly say that not only can we transfer things from biology to our engineered products, but we can also use computational design and engineering to better understand biology, because through working with my biologist partners, we realized that there's so much that they don't know about nature. And this was just a nice project that we did where we used 4D printing to test out their hypotheses that they had about this carnivorous plant that was able to create these really interesting shapes in capturing its prey. So the last project that I want to talk about is how we can use 4D printing for buildings. That was the question that I posed in the very beginning of my talk. And can we upscale 4D printing for a real application? And this is a project that I worked on in a group of architects, a group of material scientists, biologists. And this was actually we used an existing building, or we used a sort of building as a case study and designed the building together to develop a facade for that building. And the goal of that was to adapt our foundational scientific research that we developed over the past like 8 years to a real building. And that meant that there were some new challenges in terms of how to integrate self-shaping design into a real building, and how to have it react across a longer time scale than we're used to, and whether or not it was possible to even upscale the production process. So we use that building, what's called the LiveMats Biomimetic Shell, which is located at the University of Freiburg. There was a larger design team, but through working with them, we decided to place the building facing south on site, so that we could use that large south-facing facade to harvest the heat during the winter. And that also meant that we really needed to block out the heat during the summer. And we wanted to use as minimal as possible heating and cooling in the building to maintain year-round comfort. So yeah, the design of this adaptive shading facade during the winter months, they're open to let in the heat, the free heat from the sun, to warm the interior spaces. And during the summer, when it's hot, they should really shield and block out the sun. So I talked a lot about moisture responsive materials, humidity responsive materials. So you might be wondering how we adapt that to shading. And in temperate climates like southern Germany, but also here in Boston in the northeast US, there's a reliable link between humidity and temperature. So if you look at the typical cool winter day, when the humidity is high, the temperature remains low. On a summer day, you see much more daily oscillations in temperature and humidity, but it always remains with that inverse relationship. So then, as a result, we designed our mechanisms to open when it's humid, to bend, and then when it's dry and hot, it closes. It becomes flat. So we also needed to match the response time of the material to the time scale of weather changes in Freiburg. And together with material scientists, we developed a highly responsive filament material with, we studied the best polymer and how much cellulose we could fill into that material. And then we tested that system in the lab, oscillating in high-low humidities, many cycles, where we actually learned that LED adhesives are not really robust against high humidities, but we saw that our mechanisms were actually quite robust against being attacked multiple times by the LEDs. I also built a mock-up of the facade system in Stuttgart, very similar. It's very close to Freiburg, so very similar conditions. And the facade mock-up faces the same orientation, is at the same height as the target building, so we could actually evaluate the system across all seasons, across all the temperature UV effects for over a year. And with that assurance from the lab testing, from the testing in real weather conditions, we then felt assured to rent 4 3D printing machines, and we were able to fabricate all of our elements in 17 days, working 10 hours a day. So there was always someone that was keeping watch on the production, and there were about 450 elements that we produced. It's very material efficient, so each of these only took 20 minutes on average, and they're also flat, so compared to traditional additive manufacturing, it's substantially faster. We had these integrated press fit connections that we then popped onto the aluminum strips, which were pre-assembled in the lab. And then after pre-assembling those windows, we did another cycle test just to make sure that each window there were no defects before we actually put it into the building. Then, with all of those windows pre-packaged, we had 8 pre-packaged windows. All of them were a different shape. All of the elements were a different shape. Everything was bespoke. We put everything into a minivan, and just me and my student assistant, we were able to drive this to the construction site and also bring it up to the roof. So we didn't need any heavy equipment or anything. It was very, very lightweight and easy to install. From the roof, we had designed the windows to have these operable glass doors, which allowed us to place in those prepackaged windows, but also allows us to always, repair or replace as needed. So far, we haven't had to do that. And what's important to note is that there are these vents on the top and the bottom of that window box frame, which allows those 4D printed elements to be in contact with the outdoor weather, but still be protected by the glass. So this is what it looks like in real life after installation. And you can see here, this is just like 2 days after, it was immediately working, which I was very happy to see. And just as a kind of anecdote, I also have these sensors on the inside of those windows to monitor the temperature and humidity, and a camera to track the shape change. And that took over a year to get working, but the material was automatically functioning to the environment. So that kind of just illustrates how robust these technologies can be compared to how we conventionally do things. And this is just like a comparison from the inside that shows you on March 22nd. That was just a few days after the installation, where in the morning was quite cold at 11 Celsius. And then in the afternoon, it started to heat up and they closed. Yeah, so this is just another time lapse showing, you know, the function. But I also just want to say that I think it's the first 4D printed bio-inspired facade that I know of. So we're very, very happy that also this is a public building. It's open to the students of Freiburg University, the faculty. They have their classes and they do their research and have meetings in here. So if you're ever there, you're welcome to go take a look. And then just kind of talking about what I'm doing now, we recently were awarded a project, an EU project to, well, what I hope is to not just do facades, but to look at other parts of the building, other parts of the structure, integrate load-bearing capacities, but also adaptive properties, so that maybe we don't have to print that, or maybe we don't have to have a aluminum box frame, but the whole thing can be made out of a cellulosic material that is also recyclable and biodegradable. So I want to close with this. Unfortunately, I really like this video, but for some reason it's not playing. This is like a new computer, and it's the first time I'm presenting on this computer, but I just wanted to say that, emphasize again that the facade doesn't need any operating energy to operate, to shade. And I think what's interesting is that it demonstrates resilience against things like power outages, and the complex engineering that is typical of these electromechanical systems. And to emphasize that we were just using fused filament deposition machines. These are really, really commonly available and accessible printers. Probably everyone, I mean, I'm sure there are a bunch of those here. And it's also using cellulose, which is the most abundant biomass on Earth, and a very cheap resource as well. So so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can still learn from nature on how these natural materials can be sustainable yet performative. And that's what I will be continuing to do in my research going forward at Cornell and through my teaching, is to investigate how we can harness those really interesting characteristics of natural materials to perform more advanced functions, so that one day we can create a future where our technologies are no different from nature. So thank you very much, and I am looking forward to hearing your questions.
Great. Do we have any questions from the audience? In the room. I personally bring in acorns in the wintertime into the house because of the moisture retention. Yeah. So as someone who does that on the side, it's amazing to see the application being put into building facades. Yeah. Do we have any questions?
So I missed the first 10 minutes, I'm sorry. All of your materials are humidity activated?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm mostly working with cellulose-based materials because our initial role model or kind of inspiration was the pine cone. And it's been actually well studied, but my goal was always to see that mechanism being applied in buildings.
With your mesostructure design, are you doing any kind of multi-scalar development as well? So, yeah.
Yeah, so actually something really interesting about the pinecone is that they're always learning something new about it. It's not just a bilayer, but they're actually hierarchical bilayers within that structure. So something that I've been, well, the technical translation has been rather abstracted. But what I would be really interested in is if we could embed multiple hierarchies of mechanisms within that structure. And that's something that the biologist has recently kind of discovered. And so I'm interested to see what kind of functionality that can bring in. Some of the ideas that I have with that are that perhaps we can have timed, degradation, or like kind of programmable functionalities that are not just one-to-one to the environment, but there could be like overrides or like could be triggers for things.
Yeah, fascinating. I think that really challenging, or at least what I'd run into in the past there, is in the manufacturing of those multiscalar structures. And
Yeah.
if you get into like your nano, an FFF process or an FDM, whatever you want to call it, it makes it very difficult then.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that I think downsizing is a very difficult problem. Upscaling is also a difficult problem. But I think, as an architect who is more comfortable with those larger scales, when you are working on, for example, robotic scale platform, what's I think interesting with like the example of the wood actuators and the 3D printing is that you can tune those resolutions, right? If you don't need a high resolution, you use like a more, I guess, bulky or coarse material, yeah. And then you can have areas which are having very fine resolution. So that's something that I'm trying to also integrate better, is like that multi-resolution fabrication process.
Awesome, thank you.
Vicky, did you want to come off mute and ask your question, or would you like me to bring it up?
Yeah, I can come off mute. I guess I was just curious if you have, if you've seen any of the work of Mike Levin, who's who leads the Allen Center for Biology at Tufts, but he's doing some wild stuff around goal-directed and agentic biological nature, like how does a newt grow an arm and also stop growing in the arm when the arm finishes, and how that stuff works. I put a link in there to a new talk that he just gave at the Wolfram Institute. But it feels to me like the next level of what you're doing could be how to make these more agentic.
That's really interesting. I'm not familiar with his work, but I think there are a lot of interesting examples from nature that I don't know if these examples are super well understood. For example, like these geckos, or that like they lose their limb, but how do they adapt to those situations? How do they how does their gait change, and how do they regrow? Like there's a lot of different aspects I think are super interesting. And when you do, this is a little bit of a tangent, but when you do biological research, sometimes you can't just cut off their arms, right? And you can't just I mean, there's animal ethics and stuff like that. So what I think is really interesting is if we could use engineering, 4D printing to better understand those things. And through my experience with this is what's called reverse biomimetics, we can help better understand biology, and then we can take those interesting insights back into engineering. So I haven't really worked with animals specifically, but I think it's really interesting because there are a lot of things. We can cut plants and we can image them and stuff, but with animals, there's a lot we can learn. And I think we can use technology to really understand them better. So it's a little bit of a tangent. I'm going to look into.
Yeah, I strongly encourage you to look at it, because I think they are doing some pretty profound things that are leading not only to theories, but actually he does the experiments. He's the one who built anthrobots that actually go and repair neurons from throat cells, and all sorts of things. But there's some, I think, profound overlap with what might be possible in architecture. And just for context, one of our researchers that audited us back in the day wrote a paper around goal-directed design, Francisco Orio, who kicked off with our CTO, Jeff, basically our whole generative design effort. And it was all around kind of goal-directedness and how systems can use agentic stuff, obviously AI and sensing. But it feels like where you're going is kind of it's so ripe for that next level. of sort of wrapping that in. And it's curious because there's experimental proof out there now, and that's why I put the link in. I think it's really worth seeing because I think it's kind of rogue research that is pretty profound.
Cool, thanks so much.
We also had another question from 3DMC. Not sure. It's probably a satellite team from San Francisco, I believe. Yeah. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question? Or I can read off the chat. Interesting talk, Tiffany. They had a question about your wearable project. The force in the graph seems quite low to replace the cast. How would you change your design to achieve those higher forces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in the very beginning, it wasn't really our goal to, well, at least we thought we would achieve similar to what nature could achieve. So which is about 1 Newton, I think. And then we saw that we were able, towards the end of the project, that we were able to surpass that. So I think there's a lot of research that we can continue to do to basically achieve even higher forces. But I think a lot of the bottleneck is actually the materials, because there's a limit to how much we can tune or how we can modulate those properties using a material. So I would say that in that project, we were using a off-the-shelf wood filament. So if we were to move forward and this is something, because we worked with the University Hospital of Freiburg, and they are interested in continuing that research. And so we're always looking for material scientists to develop the right materials for that. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to always put the responsibility on the material scientist, but also something that we discussed was that actually for some cases, we don't really want a huge amount of forces. So we also don't want something to squeeze too hard, right? So we have to understand for specific pathologies, what is the right parameters, or what kind of specifications we should achieve. And in that case, it was more like a proof of concept. So indeed, I think the next step is really to identify a specific, like a very, a real use case for that, and then try to develop that as a next iteration.
You know, it could be an interesting one. I just thinking, for a lot of prostheses, right, you have a socket, like for someone with limb loss. And because this is humidity activated, I wonder if there's an opportunity there to make it easy to put on the socket with a loose fit. And then you don't want high force, so the low force that it generates would just make sure it's snug. I am totally making this up as I go, but that just came to mind.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. One of the thoughts I also had was because I think we've all probably broken our arms, and I was always really annoyed at the showering process because it gets really gross. And so you don't really need to wear it 24 hours a day, right? So if you could just release them in those certain situations, if they could loosen in the shower, then you can really kind of wash your skin. Then after you dry off, put it back on, and it kind of grabs on again. So these are kind of things that, like, a slight loosening to remove. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I think, possibilities there.
Great. Let's see if we have any other questions. I think that wraps up our Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for coming on site. Thank you, Tiffany, for that amazing presentation. And yeah, until next time, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for the talk. Have a nice day.